Hello, it's Jay. Let's talk about The Mrrw Thvs, a 2017 YA post-apocalyptic novel by Georgian Bay Métis writer Cherry Demeline. I've actually read one of her later books, Empire of the Wild, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and then I decided I'd go back to this book, which I heard a lot about through Canada Reads. And this is very much a book of, my take from this is, remember that even though for you, we're just living in our regular world, that this is the post-apocalypse for the experience of the indigenous culture of North America. They had contact and the apocalypse happened. And what they've been living ever since has been the post-apocalypse. Now, this novel does envision a future. It envisions a future where the general wide world has lost the power to dream. But the only people who can still dream are indigenous people. And the white culture has decided, for their own survival, for their own purposes, that we are going to take indigenous people and harvest them to try and find a cure or to find a treatment to stave off what seems to be the inevitable from happening. Our protagonist in this book, the viewpoint character, I think it is, is it told in the first person? I believe it is Francis Frenchie, a Métis boy, 15-year-old Métis boy who has lost both his parents, and in the opening sections of this book loses his brother to recruiters. And he does stumble upon a group of surviving indigenous people. I think most of them are Utes, and they go on the run. They're looking for their people. They're looking for a safe place to be, to get back to their own land and to survive off that, and to evade capture by these very self-righteous recruiters who are like, oh, we're doing this for your own good. They're battling that. They're also battling a lot of the kind of internalized traumas that they have gone through a system that has slowly kind of ground them down as the highly racist white culture. So first thing you have to say in this book, and it gets referenced within the story, is they have memories of the residential schools that are besmirched the past of both Canada and the United States, where the policy was to try and kill the Indian through extinguishing culture, horrible conditions in general. So it's very much, the recruiters very much seem like a lot of the other authority figures that have come in actual fact in the past to take away indigenous people for their own good, actually turning out to be for the own good of the white settler culture who wanted to take the land and exploit the land, basically suck the marrow right out of the indigenous culture. It's very bracing to be in a story and go, oh, we're the villains. That white settler culture are very much the villains of this story, and that regardless of where you are a part of white settler society, you're culpable in it and you've benefited from it. And if in this kind of post-apocalypse story, they came up with a cure, all of the culture would benefit from that cure. I like that the book doesn't get bogged down in some kind of like a world building thing. I've heard opposing viewpoints of like, oh, how can I take this seriously? It doesn't make any scientific sense that people can't dream, and how is indigenous people that significantly genetically different that this would make sense. It's like, it's not supposed to make sense. It's like Hunger Games. It's the people who get really hung up that the world building in the Hunger Games isn't that accurate. That's not really the point of the story. It's the power it's the power it's the power plays that are happening, the cultural interactions are the things that are actually the interesting points. So for me, that's that, you know, if you're super into, I want everything to be super kind of structurally correct, that this wouldn't be the story for you. And you know, for that to go further, if you're not into post-apocalyptic stories, if you're not into YA novels, I don't know if this would particularly be the YA novel, the YA post-apocalyptic novel that would change your mind on that fact. I think it's well done, but it's not like, it's not genre transcending or anything like that. You know, that said, Frenchie himself is sort of your bog standard decent young man protagonist of a lot of these stories. You know, he gets jealous, he falls in love, he is you know, he's dealing with his with anger. There is this sort of very much a thing of him struggling with kind of a personal choice of like who he wants to be with versus his kind of what he feels is maybe his duty to his community in there. So there is that, but I found myself being kind of a little bit more interested in the other members of his little group, and like, oh, what are they doing? And maybe that would be a bit more interesting. So he was an okay vessel for the story, but he was more just sort of okay that way. I wasn't that as much interested in him. You know, that said, the writing is very kind of clear and easy to listen to. There is some poetic, what I felt like poetic reaching at the end, where we're getting to the end of the story, and you know, give Demeline credit. She's not trying to make it like, oh, and they lived all happily ever after. It does have a kind of an appropriate open end to it, but there was a bit of that kind of reachingness of language at near in the end, which I was like, kind of, I felt like dial that back. That especially when you're going through the viewpoint of a 15-year-old boy, it rang a little less true to me. Not that you can't have very poetic 15-year-old boys, or you know, some of the people around him couldn't have kind of more of a poetic, more of a spiritual line to them, but I found that wavering. I have to say, getting to the end of the story, I was like, fine, like, okay, and you know, maybe they'll make it, maybe they won't make it. That kind of open-ended was fine, but I'm not really interested in a sequel. I know that on Goodreads this is listed as like #1 of the sequence, and I don't think I'd be interested in going on to the next one. It was interesting. I think the main point of this, like, oh yeah, we are in a post-apocalypse if you happen to be an indigenous person, and if you're someone part of the white culture, you're probably, I would say, from my reading and from my kind of exploration of Canadian history, that you're kind of culpable in making this a post-apocalypse for indigenous people, which is, you know, that's a really good message to get out there, as well as I can see this being a book that indigenous people would say, you know, this is our struggle, that there's, and the decisions that a young person might need to make coming up, an indigenous person might have to make coming up. This would be kind of a useful book to kind of have a discussion about, you know, what do I want to do in my life? You know, I'm not an indigenous person, but I can imagine, that would be an interesting discussion there. I have to say, I'm probably more interested in her kind of more adult, though still genre fiction. I definitely would recommend Empire of the Wild, her 2019 novel, which is kind of a thing of ongoing. It's a contemporary novel with kind of ongoing exploitation of land, resources by kind of settler society, married with a Rougarou tale, which is sort of, it's a Métis werewolf story. So the combination of those two, Demoline definitely seems to be interested in using genre stories to tell kind of stories that are politically hooked in with the struggles and the concerns of Métis society and Indigenous society in a wider sense in North America, which I think all good genre fiction, if it's you could have completely escapist genre fiction, which is quote unquote apolitical, which usually means you're just happy with the status quo, or it's political because you're not happy with the status quo and you want to make comments on the society and use the storytelling juice of a werewolf story to underline that and to highlight that. So yeah, those are my thoughts on The Mrrw Thvs by Cherry Demoline. All right, I've been Jay. Deep breath. More videos later.